Welcome to this community forum on the financial forecast for your Columbus City schools. I want to thank Dr. Walker for hosting us this evening. Raise your hand, Dr. Walker. Thank you very much for having us here. I also want to recognize Board Member Ramona Reyes right here up front. Thank you for being here this evening. On behalf of my colleagues on the Columbus Board of Education, testing? All right. All right. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your thoughts and concerns and hopefully some constructive ideas. Let me start by saying that every investment we make as a district is valuable, and behind the dollar signs are the faces of our more than 51,000 students and nearly 9,000 staff. These conversations about potential budget reductions are not meant to discredit the value of any person or program. If we had our way, we would keep every item listed, but instead, we recognize that priorities must be set when the state fails to provide us with full funding. I hope you appreciate that our process has been data-driven and respectful, and that our board and district leaders are here tonight with open minds and a willingness to have constructive conversations. Staff from the district will be capturing your feedback throughout the evening. And the start of tonight's meeting is also being streamed on Facebook Live, so more of our community members can follow along. And if you're not able to share your thoughts tonight, or you have an idea or concern that comes to you later, please make sure you still share your feedback either online, on our app, on the phone, through email or regular mail, or even in person. So to begin, I'm going to ask our district treasurer and CFO, Stan Bohoric, to run through the numbers of the financial forecast so we all better understand how we got here. Then we will have our interim superintendent, Dr. John Stanford, launch us into our conversations. And again, on behalf of the board, thank you all very much for being here this evening. Mr. Treasurer.
Thank you, President Baker, and good evening. My job this evening is to run through some of the assumptions and changes in those assumptions from 2016 when we began our planning for the November 16 levy, and how those changes in the assumptions affected the forecast and how it brought us to where we are today. In 16, as you know, we began the planning for an operating levy to be placed on the November 16 ballot, and when it passed, we updated our forecast to what you see here on this graph. This is the cash balance from the December update to the forecast. And as you can see, first noteworthy is that it goes out to fiscal 21 because the forecast back in 16 just included out the 5 years out to 21. But here you can see that the 2021 fiscal year, although slightly negative, actually was at a point where we had pretty much planned it to be when we were doing the levy campaign. We were shooting for a zero balance at 2021, knowing that positive cash flow variances over the year would carry us through that point. But most notable was the revenue assumption relative to the growth in the cap on state revenue. I think most everybody here knows that there is a calculated amount in state funding, but the legislature has decided for some districts through another calculation to cap that growth, and we are subject to that growth. At that time during the biennium, we were receiving 7.5% growth. We get 7.5% more each year of that 2-year biennium. And all of us who put the forecast together, along with the Finance and Appropriations Committee, and then ultimately adopted by the board, elected to continue that assumption throughout the forecast. Just a month or two after we did the December update, the discussions at the state level for the next biennium, the biennium that we are in right now, began. And the chatter from the State House that we heard was that the state cap the growth in the state cap was not going to be what it had been in the past. That in fact, some folks in one house would talk about 0% growth. Folks in the other chamber would talk about something greater than that, like plus 5.5%. And in fact, I believe it was the governor's proposal in his budget that would be at plus 5%. So after that, in May of 17, we adopted a May forecast with a plus 5 revenue cap. And then fast forward to where we are today, and in reality, when they ultimately adopted the state biennium in June of 17, the state revenue cap was at plus 4. So you can see that if I back up, that impact from in 21 from minus 17, a deficit of 17, to a deficit of 89. It was a significant change in the assumption in the state revenue that we could expect, and it exacerbated the situation out to fiscal 22, and that's where we face the 224 projected deficit, 224 million projected deficit. Last fall, we began to consider what we should do to address this deficit, or at least begin to address the deficit. The administration and staff worked last fall and then into the early part of this year to identify expenditure line items that would be potential items for reduction. Some of the guiding principles were, I think, what we heard from the board were to keep the levy promises relative to the addition of FTE, to not be on the ballot for another operating levy until calendar year 2020, and to, through the reductions, affect programs in the classroom as little as possible. To organize our thoughts about the reductions, we use this matrix, if you will, to try and filter through and organize our reductions. First, we would look at them as to whether they're required to be done or not required to be done. Required could be by state law, it could be by board policy, but it was one way to kind of filter out those possible reductions. And then we looked at the return on our investment, and that return on investment could be quantitative or it could be qualitative. But once we looked at our items this way, we could see that, you know, if it's required and the return on investment is very high, those were line items we wanted to keep. But on the far opposite end of that, if it's not required to be done and our return on investment is low, those were items that we would likely be able to reduce. So it was just a model to use to evaluate and organize our thoughts as we got into the reductions. So here we are with the October forecast. I remind folks at the Finance and Appropriations Committee, as well as the board, that we really shouldn't plan for a zero balance at the end of any fiscal year, that our target and best practices should really be about a month's worth of operating capital. And for this district, that's about $80 million. So in our planning process, when we look at expenditures and revenues, we really should try and operate the district so that any one year we're not less than 30 days cash balance. As I said, in this case, it would be $80 million. So here, you'll hear us sometimes reference that our deficit target is really about $304 million that we are trying to address, at least at this time. Right during the early part of our discussions, the federal government was having their own sets of issues trying to stay in operation. They passed a continuing resolution, though, and in that continuing resolution was a provision to delay the Cadillac tax. That's a provision in the Affordable Care Act that has to do with a tax, if you will, on health care plans at a certain level, and we actually will be subject to that Cadillac tax. So we immediately factored that in, and that amounted to about $12 million in reduced expenditures, bringing now that deficit to $212 million. We often talk about our forecasting being conservative. And in conservative forecasting, what typically happens is that actual revenues come in a bit higher than you estimate, and actual expenditures come in a bit lower than what you originally estimate. So for planning here, and while I would not change our conservative forecasting methodology for the actual forecast, at least here is we're talking about the dollar amount of expenditures that we may need to identify. We did want to take into consideration that it would be reasonably likely that we would experience positive cash flow during the years of this forecast, and we estimate that to be about $15 million a year. So that added $60 million to the fiscal 22 balance, and so we've brought that deficit up to $152 million as a target we need to attempt to address. So we go through the discussions, identify a very long list. You'll see them on the walls out here tonight. I believe it was some 400 lines of budget items that were up for consideration, and we narrowed that list down to a total of about $21.5 million, which is what we've been recommending as the potential list of reductions, and those are up there on the walls tonight for your discussion. When we take into account the $21 million in reduction, you'll see now that an adjusted forecast, we'd be looking at about $68 million of a deficit. Again, not hitting our $80 million target. We're still about $148 million short of that. But this is the $68 million deficit is much more manageable, as you can imagine, than the 224. So that's where that's how we approached this, how we identified line items to be considered for reduction, how we prioritize them. And I'll just remind you of our assumptions at this point. First of all, several of the board's priorities, that there wouldn't be another operating levy request until 2020, that we would keep the levy promise to add FTE over this 5-year period, and I believe that was about 325 positions to be added, and that we would attempt to minimize the impact on academic program. During this exercise, we made no change in our assumptions about revenue from the October 17 forecast. We assume that the Cadillac tax will continue, that delay in the Cadillac tax will remain in effect. We've learned that sometimes the federal government will give you something and then they'll take it away, but we have to, for this exercise, assume that that will remain in effect for the time period we're talking about. We also assume that our conservative forecast will, in fact, generate for us a positive cash flow of $15 million a year for 4 years, and also that these reductions would remain in force through fiscal year 2022, that we wouldn't make these reductions and then add those programs or staffing back somewhere between now and then. And additionally, that it is desirable to shoot for that 30-day cash balance target. So that's a brief, I believe, explanation and description of how we went from a successful 2016 levy and some very positive financial outlook in December of 16 to where we are. And that is, as we've mentioned before, the main driver of that is the fact that the state revenue is not growing as rapidly as we had originally assumed. I believe with that, I'll turn this over to our interim superintendent, Dr. John Stanford, and he'll have some further words for you this evening.
Good evening, everyone, and I just want to recognize our board member, Shauna Gibbs, who just walked into the room. So tonight, we are inviting you, the community, to talk with members of our district's leadership team who identified the potential budget reductions which would take effect as a part of the 2018-2019 school year. Reductions of this magnitude are never a one-cut-fits-all solution. Overall, our team grouped these proposed reductions around 3 action items. First, we looked for opportunities where we could reduce costs but not eliminate certain supports. There are several initiatives, especially in academic services and in our administrative offices, where funding would be cut by 50% or more starting next school year. Those specific activities and the district's wide supports would still be offered, yet they would receive dramatically reduced district investment. Second, we identified a number of district-level responsibilities and staffing positions which would reallocate back to the school building level. From covering the extra costs of field trips and lunchroom monitors to providing media technology support in the classroom, the district will now look to principals to identify resources within their building teams and budgets to account for these types of needs within our buildings. Third, there are several proposed reductions that realign many of the operational services to minimum levels and realign certain academic offerings to reflect state-mandated requirements only. To be clear, in a budget predominantly driven by personnel expenses, about 85% of our general revenue fund is made up of personnel. Reductions of this magnitude will certainly impact personnel numbers district-wide. So you will see more than 160 proposed FTE reductions in your discussions in the breakout sessions. This is a combination of certificated, classified, and administrative positions across the district. Our hope is that a significant number of these positions would be handled through normal attrition at the end of the school year. We know that $21 million in proposed reductions would have a dramatic impact on the district's services to our students and would be felt in every school and neighborhood across the district. Still, we have to have these conversations to maintain our fiscal stability and to be good stewards of the district's resources. Tonight, we want to hear from you. We want to answer your questions and to provide some clarity on the proposed reductions. We want to enlist your help and to get your insight on ideas that we may have not considered. Throughout this evening, our team will ask if there are alternative ways in which we could still accomplish the same outcomes, but perhaps we do it in a more efficient and cost-effective way. And we will ask if you can think of any additional everyday savings that could be implemented either in the classroom or at the building level or district-wide. So in a moment, we'll be asking you to transition to 3 breakout rooms where you will be able to sit with our leadership team members and ask your questions and share your ideas with them. And so at 6:40, between now and 6:45, we're going to ask you to transition to those breakout rooms so that you can get settled in, you can review the poster boards. When you go to the breakout rooms, we will have poster boards with the various reductions that we are recommending and the reductions that we considered but are not recommending as preliminary reductions at this point in time. So, leading our session on proposed reductions for academic services will be our Chief Academic Officer, Alicia Gillison. Her team will be in the cafeteria to my left. Next, to answer your questions about the district operations and our accountability measures in the district, including questions about school choice, transportation, and building services, that conversation will be led by our Chief Operations Officer, Mr. Maurice Oldham, and our Chief Accountability Officer, Dr. Michelle Klein. Mr. Oldham and Dr. Klein will be leading that group discussion in room 129, which is to my right. You go through the doors to my right, and just turn right when you get out the doors, and it's right there as soon as you get out the door. Finally, all other proposed budget reductions will be addressed by our budget director, Scott Gooding, and Scott's right there. In that discussion, we will try to answer your questions for the Board Services Office, the Budget Office, Communications, WCBE, Legal Services, and the offices of the Treasurer, the Superintendent, and Internal Auditor, along with all other district-wide services in this last room. Mr. Gooding will be leading that discussion in room 125. Again, to my right, you go through the double doors there, but when you go out the doors, you turn to your left, and the room will be right at the end of the hallway. You do not need to stay in one room. You have the flexibility of transitioning from room to room based on what items you have concerns about or ideas that you have in the 3 different areas. If you are not able to share your thoughts with us tonight, or you have an idea or a concern that comes to you later, please make sure to share those concerns or ideas with us either online, on our app, on the phone, through email or snail mail, or in person where possible. And on the screen are the various different ways that you can share your ideas and thoughts with us. We've given everyone here tonight information on how to share your input on these budget reductions, and I encourage you to join in when you have the opportunity. So with that, we will have this short break of time to transition from this room to the 3 breakout rooms so that you can begin your conversations with our leadership teams at around 6:45. And if you want to get started a little earlier, you're more than welcome to do that. We will have these discussions in the breakout rooms until about 7:45. We will not come back to this room at the end of the evening. You can head on home after the breakout session discussions with with our leadership teams. So again, on behalf of the Board of Education, thank you all very much for attending this evening's community forum, and we look forward to hearing your ideas, your suggestions, and your concerns. Thank you very much.